second, everybody got the sheet? The final sheets? Let's see if Mr. Connor started that. There's, okay.
Do they have a jacket in here?
I don't know. What does it look like?
It's a North Face jacket.
You guys see a North Face jacket that belongs to him? No, sorry.
Okay, thank you.
What about the one that was left in the Amsterdam room?
That was a instruments jacket. It's been there for
Oh,
months.
never mind.
Okay, so our second review session deals with the lead up to the American Revolution, and then the revolution itself, and then the transition through the Articles of Confederation into the Constitution. This is one of my favorite eras of American history, so I'll try not to talk about it too much in too much excruciating detail. The first thing I will avoid is talking about each and every one of the acts. Here's what you need to know about that. The acts are taxes on various commodities. Remember that the system of the economic model that the British have imposed on us at this time and during the colonial era is a mercantilist one. Mercantilism is it looks like a free market. It has the but it's not capitalism the way we'd recognize it, because basically the government acts to protect and promote certain businesses and penalize others. So it's like if you had a free market that was constantly being tampered with by the government. So maybe in some ways we do have something along those lines. Now it's not what it's supposed to be. Right? All of this emerges. If you remember during the first session, we talked about this period of salutary neglect. Right? All of this kind of emerges, this period of taxation, and the reason that the colonists get so mad about the taxes is because we didn't really have it before the French and Indian War. Right? The French and Indian War breaks out in 1754. It is notable, right? Because George Washington himself starts it. He's a young colonial militia commander and sort of leading some troops into the backcountry of what is now Ohio. He stumbles across some French soldiers. Things go awry. Shooting happens, and some French soldiers are killed. Some colonial troops are killed. Washington retreats, and then there's a whole standoff. The French will overrun his fortification, and he will be captured, and they will force him to sign a paper paper in French that he can't really read. They lie to him about what it says, according to Washington. That said, where he basically assumes sole responsibility for this. So this war, what we call the French and Indian War in American history, 7 Years' War in Europe and AP Euro, it's the same thing. Actually, it's notable because Americans had fought in other British-French conflicts to this point, but this is the first time we really started one. And so that's an often misunderstood thing about that. Washington will come home, and for whatever reason, will be greeted as a war hero in colonial Virginia, and people just admired George Washington. He's this remarkable sort of guy. The war ends in 1763, and the French and Indian War, like all wars, is really damn expensive. And so the British, from their perspective, the way they see it, they say, hey, look, you colonials, we leave you alone, we don't bother you, we don't make you pay any taxes, you're free to you have, in a lot of ways, more personal liberties than other people in the British Empire did. You had a generally better situation if you were, say, a day laborer in colonial Philadelphia, assuming you weren't enslaved, in colonial Philadelphia or Boston than you would have in London. You made more money, you lived better. There were fewer people, so there's fewer disease, less disease, and that's there's kind of a thing there. And the British, from their perspective, they're saying, look, we leave you to your own devices, but you can't go starting wars that cost the crown money. And because you did, you got to pay up. So from their perspective, that's a perfectly reasonable thing. A few taxes now levied against certain goods coming into or leaving from the colonies that you have to pay some taxes on. Now, we talk a lot about that taxation without representation thing, and that's an important component of it. That's fundamentally undemocratic for a government to be able to take your money without you having any say in how they spend it.
that's not, that's a foundational principle of America, right? That our government is elected by us, they spend money on our behalf. Sometimes they maybe don't, there's problems with that, but it's how that's supposed to work. Right? So the British start passing all these acts. The things on here you really got to pay attention to, though, the things that we don't pay as much attention to now, 200 and some odd years later, but that were way more important at the time, are things like the writs of assistance and the admiralty courts, the Townshend Acts. These things suspend time-honored traditions of English common law, like habeas corpus, right? That principle from Latin that means "show me the body." If I'm accused of a crime, if I am accused in the analogy murder, you have to produce a body. You have to show that you have to show evidence against me. The burden of proof is on the state to prove that I did something. I am innocent until I am proven guilty. Right? This idea of a trial by jury of your peers, of a trial in the community in which you live, all of these things are sort of things that we hold as sacred aspects of American law and government, things that we enshrine into our Constitution, actually predate the Constitution by 1,000 years or so. A lot of that stuff goes back all the way back to the Magna Carta. So this is part of English common law. And as colonials, we are British, so we are subjects of the British Crown, so we are entitled to the protections of English common law. Remember, the British monarchy is not an absolute one, the way the French monarchy or something like that is. There are laws and there are rules, and even the king himself is under the law, right? And so the British kind of just start suspending that. These colonials, they're getting out of hand, and of course when they do, we get rowdy, and then you're going to suspend our natural rights. This is also the era of the Enlightenment. And we talk about rights, and these are natural things that belong to us because we exist. Right? We are endowed with them by nature or nature's God, depending how you see that. And so for the British government to act to curtail those natural rights and then to tax us, that's really the rub. How are you going to do that to us? So for Americans, we get kind of pissed about that, and there's some things that kind of go down. Some rabble-rousing in Boston that leads to a massacre in 1770. We pitch a hell of a lot of tea into Boston Harbor in 1773. And after the British start taxing tea. Now, note that none of those taxes really amount to a lot of money. It's really people always say like it's the principle of the thing. It really was the principle of the thing. It's really what it comes down to. None of them really amount. The Sugar Act, for example, is one of my favorite. It amounted to 3 cents a gallon on a gallon of rum, because that's what it was really a tax on, because you refined sugar to make rum, and everybody in the colonies were pretty heavy drinkers, and so you were taxing people's booze, and they got really upset about it. It's kind of really what it is. I mean, it's really hitting people where they live. It's their paper goods that they need to write letters, to correspond with people, and the rum that they drink, and all these. It's people kind of take it personally. From the British perspective, they're like, but you're acting like a bunch of hoodlums, and so we have to kind of impose some law and order and some taxation. So the British think that they're well within their rights to do that. So all of these acts, it used to be really important when people learned history to learn all the acts and learn them in order, and I always thought that was stupid. There are a few that are important. 1774, the Intolerable Acts. There's a series of them. That to me is one that stands out. When I was in high school, I had this teacher, and he said, "You have to learn all these acts because it's American history." And I'm like, "Well, technically, wasn't that British history because there wasn't an America yet?" And then I got detention for being whatever. But I mean, it's not wrong. So the Intolerable Acts is really one of these things where it really kind of note the relatively late date of this, like coming right up on the war. The Intolerable Acts is where the British, they're punitive. It's not just about taxes anymore. We're gonna show these Americans who's boss. These colonials have just gotten out of hand, and we're gonna have to rein them in. So you see that in 1774. The reaction to that is the formation of the First Continental Congress. Right? The first time all 13 colonies that will become the first 13 states, that they really kind of start talking to each other, and they form this Continental Congress. And there are a few states that don't send delegates, but most of them do, to this First Continental Congress. And all they really agree to do at the First Continental Congress is meet again in a year. right? So it's the Second Continental Congress that comes along 1775 that effectively becomes the governing body of the United States during the Revolution. And they're, it's a wartime government, and it's their chief and maybe really only concern is independence. Once we decide that we're going to do that, but that's really where that's really the steps of that. The Continental Congress becomes our governing body, if you will, during the war. The Congress that George Washington answers to. Right, 1775. Note, you get the first shots of the Revolution fired fully a year before we declare the United States of America. This is often confusing to people. America's birthday is when?
1776.
What day?
July 4th.
Yeah. Okay. Good, because we celebrate it every year. It's kind of a big deal. Okay. So every year we sell it. There's a date in American history you need to know. It's that one. That's when we finally declare America's independence. But we've already done Lexington and Concord and Ticonderoga, Bunker Hill, some of these early battles that people are passingly familiar with. Understand that the importance of those things. Lexington and Concord, not much of battles. These are Boston area militiamen who they don't have really a lot of military training or experience with guns or any of that kind of stuff. And they're facing off against a very battle-hardened British army. So they don't really amount to much in terms of battle, right? What it really does is it pisses the British off, and they lay siege to Boston Harbor, right? So Boston becomes an occupied city, and the militia is basically outside, in the outskirts of the city, and they're saying to the rest of the country, hey, war is happening here. This is when Patrick Henry says that the war has already begun on the plains of Boston. You can talk all you want about peace, but they're already shooting us. So, you can either shoot back or you can, just get shot. And it is basically the way he lays that out. Now, it's really important that the Second Continental Congress, that when they want to respond as a group, because the people who form this are people who wanted independence. Ultimately, they want to move away from Great Britain. But to get the people on their side, it can't be a war of Massachusetts colony against the British. It has to be the American colonies. So when George Washington shows up at the Second Continental Congress, he's this military hero, the closest thing we had to a military hero, from a homegrown one in the colonies. And he shows up, and he shows up wearing a black armband, expressing his solidarity for his brothers in Massachusetts. That's the way as a Virginian, that was powerful. And so John Adams and some of these other Massachusetts guys, that's got to be our war leader. That's got to be the guy. Because so now it's not just a revolution of Boston; it's a revolution of the colonies, right? We hang together or we hang separately. Ben Franklin is this sort of thing. Now, so Washington will go and assume command of the Revolutionary Army outside of Boston and consistently get his butt kicked in the field. He's not a great military commander, right? He's a great survivor. He's not a great military strategist. He's often misunderstood about Washington. He was great at running spies and military intelligence and communications. He was not great at battle strategies, and he never had a real big army to speak of. Well, all that's happening in 1776. We're trying to turn the corner. We're trying to get people on board here. So a guy named Thomas Paine will write a pamphlet called Common Sense. Right? Both of these things happen in this and the Declaration of Independence, two important writings that happened in 1776. Right? Vital for there to be an America. Right? The Declaration of Independence from a boy T. Jeffs is that's the poetry of America. This is what, we're not just a bunch of drunken farmers fighting over taxes and habeas corpus. We are elevating the human condition. This is a declaration of human rights. America will be this fundamentally different thing, a thing that the world has never seen. Truly a self-governing nation. And so it creates this idea, these American ideals. But it's poetic. If you've read the Declaration of Independence, it's beautiful. But it doesn't sway ordinary people the way common sense does, because Thomas Paine speaks in the common language of the day, and he says, "Look, revolution is just common sense. You can, and he just kind of basically lays out this argument: are you going to be a sheep who's going to be taxed and mistreated by the British government, or are you going to take a stand and maybe take a hand in governing yourself? It's going to be scary, it's going to be hard, but there really isn't any other choice. And he kind of lays it out there real plain like that. So that's an important component of this. That's where we start to turn the corner, where the majority of the average people in the colonies, now the states, are actually in favor of the war, because early on they're not. And so you really kind of start swaying public opinion, then you get more support. A key military victory in this war, 1778 at Saratoga. Washington is not in command at Saratoga, but the United States Army is basically able to fight the British to a standstill. Enough of a standstill that you could maybe call it a victory in America's favor, the first large-scale one that we had had. Right? This will convince the French that we're serious. This and a lot of diplomacy from Benjamin Franklin. Franklin convinces the British or the French, hey, look, if you really want to stick it to the British, you hate them, we hate them, let's be buddies. That's about as far as it goes, the Franco-American alliance. Get with us, give us some ships and guns and all these things, and send some troops to support us, and you can really stick it to the British. And the French king really wants to stick it to the British. And so he'll spend a lot of money, a whole lot of money. So much money, Benjamin Franklin will con him so much money that it will bankrupt the French court, and that will lead, of course, to the French Revolution, and he'll lose his head. So sorry about that, France. But, so that's kind of how that whole thing goes down. 1781, of course, the Battle of Yorktown, Washington's one military victory in his whole life, but it's just the one that counted. That's American perseverance right there. You can get beat as many times as you can, as long as you keep getting back up. You have to win the one fight that matters, and he does, right? And we rock the world with this. People, I can't believe this nation of backwater farmers just defeated the most powerful nation on the planet. And, all right, that's great. Now we're America. Okay, now what? Right? We don't got any money. We don't have a functioning system of government. We've started crafting these Articles of Confederation. Are we going to be 13 different countries, or are we going to actually be the United States of America? Well, so now we've fought this war for independence. Now we have to invent the United States. Well, how are we going to do that? Washington very famously says, "I don't know. That's on y'all." He goes home. Right? It becomes that's again the character of Washington, the great man who can walk away from power. It's a very rare thing in the world, in the history of the human race. Right? He goes back to Mount Vernon, he's chilling, doing his thing, and the rest of everybody else is like trying to figure out how do we make a country? What are we going to do? We'll formally sign the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Now, that not only is going to formally end the war, but it gives us legal claim, as long as you just ignore the people who actually live there, the native people, to the Ohio River Valley. Right? The British cede that to this new nation of the United States. Well, now we need to populate that. We got all this great farmland, it's great, best farmland in the world. We got to get some people out there, and we got to start organizing it. Well, we're going to have a government that has some kind of authority if we're going to organize any kind of movement. So we will draft this thing in 1781, right at the end of the Revolution, called the Articles of Confederation. Right? This is our first governmental structure, and understand that this is a document written by revolutionaries. If you're looking at it, and why does it make the government so weak? Why doesn't it function? Right? It makes the central government, the federal government in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. wasn't a thing yet, or the confederal government to be more precise, because we weren't a federal system. Why does the central government so weak? Because these are revolutionaries who just fought a powerful central government. They're scared of centralized power. And so, because they react so strongly against that, they basically create a government that cannot function. The Articles of Confederation government is basically useless, with the exception of a couple of things. They do organize the settling of the Northwest Territory, the Ohio River Valley. The Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 organized that territory into. If you look at those states, even to this day, their counties. The way their states are organized are much more logical than anything east of the Appalachian Mountains. The original 13, they're just a hot mess. The way their counties are drawn makes no sense. West of that, the tradition established by these ordinances, if you look at any state west of the Appalachian Mountains, our county lines are drawn more logically because they're organized with some sort of mathematic precision given over to that. Important as a public school teacher, here's an aside, this is the first thought we ever give to public education as well in American history. In the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, it's determined that the central precinct of any county, the land at the center of any county, will be given over to education. You could build a school there for the, or you could sell that land and use it for educational purposes in some way. But it's the first time as a society that we start really thinking about, okay, well, if we're going to be free men, to Jefferson's point, free men require a free public education. You can't be free people if you can't read and write. You have to be able to express ideas, and to be able and to not be beholden to someone else to tell you what the Constitution says or what your Bible says or whatever. You have to be able to read and think for yourself. It's really important. Right? That's an Enlightenment principle. Right? Other than that, Articles of Confederation government basically useless. Right? And we're going to roll along underneath it, under it for several years, kind of ambling along, doing the best we can, but we're massively in debt from the war. We owe tons of money to the French and to the Dutch, the war loans that they've lent us. So, long about 1787, people kind of start saying, you know what, we need to really seriously think about rewriting the Articles of Confederation. So they'll call a convention in Philadelphia, and the 13 states will send representatives to Philadelphia to talk about rewriting the Articles of Confederation. And when they get there, they say, you know what, this thing is a trash fire. Let's throw it out and start over. You know, it's going to be way easier to do that. Now, that's a problem because a lot of people see this as kind of a coup, and they're a little afraid. It's like, hey, there's this government. They closed the doors. We don't actually know a lot about what people said inside the Constitutional Convention because they intended it to be closed to the press, so that people could speak freely without, like, you did everything, every idea that you float an idea out there. Maybe it's a good one, maybe it's a bad one. We need to talk it out. We can't have it tried in the court of public opinion before we work something out. So they closed the proceedings, and the thing that really keeps people from just losing their minds over that and staging, burning the building down around them, like, oh, these people are trying to seize control of the government, is that George Washington himself shows up. It was like the great man Washington. He saved us from the British. He'll make sure that these politicians don't ruin the country. And that's in fact what Washington's function is during the Constitutional Convention. He's the president of the Constitutional Convention. So while they're crafting the Constitution, and when they, and they're laying out, like, what kind of system are we going to have? Well, we're going to have a federal system, and we're going to have, and here's Article 1 that's going to talk about the legislative branch of government. Well, here's a problem that we have under the Articles of Confederation. We don't have someone who can make a decision in a crisis in a split-second fashion the way it sometimes need to. We need a president. We need a leader who's elected, who's powerful, who has he's very powerful in certain contexts, but is not a king, right? And we give him control over the military, but not the control over military spending. And we give him the ability to pardon people, but not the ability to remove a judge from office. And we do these other things. We gotta balance this out. And then, well, you know who would be a great person? This would be great if we could find a person with the temperament of George Washington. Oh, no, wait. We've got that person. So while Washington is sitting there, they craft the job of president for George Washington. Right? He is the model for the ideal American president. That's the way Article 2 of the Constitution is written. The executive branch of government is designed for him. Like, that's the person, that's the temperament, that's the kind of person, that's the kind of character that a person should have if you are going to elect them to be the president. It's kind of a tall order. You just got to be as good as George Washington, no problem, right? So this is the way that they sort of do this. The big question, the thing that almost destroys the Constitutional Convention, almost breaks the whole thing up, is the question of representation. How are we going to do that? The southern states have a smaller voting population than some of the northern states, but they want representation based on population because they want to count slaves as people. They want to count slaves as people for purposes of representation, but not as actual human beings. Right? So already we get to this point at the very beginning of the Republic where now we have to deal with this question of slavery. Jefferson himself, a slave owner, had wanted to condemn it in the Declaration of Independence. He said, you know what? Let's have a real revolution. Let's do it. Let's change it. Our economic model, the way we see this thing, it's evil. I know it's evil. The whole economy was tied to it. Is the reality is that these guys, so American history up through the Civil War is really about people kicking the can of slavery down the road. I can't deal with it. It's too complicated. It's going to create all kinds of problems. So it's a question. During the revolution, it's a question of independence, not of manumission of slavery. It's during the constitutional crisis, it's a question of unity, not slavery. We'll deal with that later. Oh, we've got to do this. We'll kick this. So right from the very beginning, you could argue that we are creating a situation that is making a conflict over slavery inevitable, because we never seem to very, very well to deal with it. What they work out is, of course, one of the most outrageous things in American history, and they write this right into the Constitution of the United States, the 3/5 compromise. Slaves will count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation. Now that's part of this compromise that we work out. We create a bicameral legislature for that very same reason. We have one house of representation where representation is based on population, and we have in the House of Representatives that's the case. In the Senate, every state gets 2. Right? So Texas has 2 senators, and Wyoming has 2 senators. Texas has 36 million people. Wyoming has 875,000 people. And that's the balance of that. Big state, little state, a lot of people, not a lot of people. Every state gets 2 senators. Texas has a crap ton more representatives, though I don't know how many we have. I think it was 35, 36, something like that.
It's 36.
Is it 36? Yeah. And probably adjusted higher after the next census coming up. We do a census every 10 years for purposes of that, and we've had massive influx of folks. So I'm looking to get to 40. Yeah, nice round number, right? California's still got us way beat at 55, and that's some of this whatever. I don't like to admit that we're second to in anything. And Alaska's only bigger than us because all those stupid islands. They shouldn't get to count the islands. This is the compromise that they work out, and it is a compromise. We have a tendency to sort of glorify the Constitution or talk about the Constitution as if it's holy writ. The fact of the matter is, these guys saw it as they believe very strongly in the notion of the contract system of government. It is a contract between all of us, and when we write a contract, and we have differences of political opinions, and we have different worldviews, but we agree that we want to live together. Contracts involve compromise, right? So nobody's entirely in love with it, but they're like, you know what? It's a pretty good system. We can improve on it. We put a process right in there, the amendment process for creating those amendments, so that we can alter this document as we see fit, right? Everybody figured it would be a thing. I think a lot of people, Jefferson, who was not at the Constitutional Convention, figures that it's a thing that really lasts for about 20 years, and then we write another one, and we do that every generation or so. We'd write a new constitution. So the idea that it's become a thing that's lived as long as it has in an amended but not horribly altered form is actually, they probably would have been surprising to those guys. They probably wrote a better document than they gave themselves credit for in terms of that. There's lots of different things there that, in terms of what the Constitution does and what it doesn't do. Note that this is a thing that's confusing. The last thing I'll say here, the confusing difference between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and Federalists and what your textbook calls Republicans, right? That's a super confusing. The Federalists and Anti-Federalists, when you talk about them in that context, these are people arguing over whether to ratify the Constitution or not. That argument goes away once we ratified it. George Washington becomes the president. But during his time as president, political parties start to emerge. And one of those parties is referred to as the Federalists, the most famous Federalist being Alexander Hamilton, right? There's also a party that starts to emerge that history textbooks, and wait for this to get super confusing, refer to alternatively as Republicans, Democrats, Democratic Republicans, Jeffersonian Republicans, Jeffersonian Democrats, or just Jeffersonians, right? Speaking of any of those is referring to a party that coalesces around Thomas Jefferson, a states' rights, less federally oriented system. Jefferson was more of an idealist, Hamilton's more of a practical guy, and you see the conflict that will emerge there that's at the center of all American political conflict probably ever since then. But it's important to understand that both the modern Republican and Democratic parties claim Jefferson as their sort of spiritual founder. It's not true for either of them. the modern Democratic Party starts in 1828, and the modern Republican Party starts in 1854. Jefferson's dead before either of those parties emerged, right? But they sort of try to lay claim to his ideas. So so political parties, as we understand them now, that doesn't solidify into the form that we think of them as Republicans and Democrats until the 1850s, right? So do not confuse anti-federalists and the Federalists argument over the Constitution with Federalists and, as your book calls them, Republicans. Those are actual political parties at that time. Questions on that? Any of that stuff? I know it's a lot. Okay, if you have any individual questions, I'll be happy to answer them. If not, have a good afternoon.